Hey guys, Josh from the Ancient History Guy here. Hello and welcome to all. I hope you're having a fantastic day. Anyways, today we are going to be looking at some proper ancient history, like this stuff is old. And of course, it's going to be about one of the oldest civilizations in history, which is of course ancient Egypt. Specifically the time ancient Egypt was actually, well, two ancient Egypts. Let's get started. So Egypt, as we all know, is one of the oldest civilizations in the world. This was mainly because the River Nile, which runs through the centre of Egypt, was an excellent river to set up shop by. The river both provided an abundance of food, whilst also having highly predictable flooding patterns. This made the area very appealing to the local people, who benefited greatly from the river's many traits. It's also worth noting that around this time, Egypt's climate was way better than it is today. There were large savannas, filled with herds of fauna. In fact, it was just bliss. In fact, most of what we call the Sahara Desert was actually quite green. Needless to say, this abundance of food and regular flood patterns convinced many of the small clusters of humans to settle in the region. Hunting became an essential part of life for these hunter-gatherers, something that would continue into Egyptian customs for thousands of years. Now, these tribes gradually began to unify into distinct entities. Eventually, Egypt was split between two distinct kingdoms, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt refers to the southern part of the Nile, which, is at the bottom of the map. But whatever, ancient Egypt, weird, let's just accept it. The ancient Egyptians referred to this as the Red Land, in reference to the land's proximity to the Sahara Desert. People began settling in this area as early as 5000 BC. Some of these settlers were nomadic hunters that lived in tents, whilst others set down firm roofs. Within 1000 years, the people of Upper Egypt were creating more intricate pottery and were beginning to bury their dead in increasingly exotic tombs. The people of this land also began to trade with the other forming civilizations in the area, noticeably Mesopotamia, and began to build cities to serve as trading centers. It should be noted that because Upper Egypt was so close to the desert, the people were pretty much limited to the banks of the Nile, meaning that there was only so much food they could realistically grow. Lower Egypt, on the other hand, was referred to as the Black Land, mainly because its soil was so dark and fertile. This was because Lower Egypt was situated around the Nile Delta, which, if you look on the map, is up at the top, not the bottom. But again, this is ancient Egypt, it's weird. Anyway, because Lower Egypt was situated around the Nile Delta, due to its proximity to the water, this area naturally lent itself to farming. This meant that Lower Egypt was able to develop far quicker than Upper Egypt, noticeably developing the grindstone, bladed tools, and plastered mud homes. This technological and advances in food would become the envy of those living in Upper Egypt, who began to want the more easily available resources of their northern neighbour. This came to a head in the 3000s BC, when constant border skirmishes eventually resulted in Upper Egypt carrying out a series of blitzkrieg battles against their neighbours. Despite fewer resources, the land had bred hard men, who militarily were superior to their more fortunate neighbours. In one final climactic battle, Upper Egypt were finally able to defeat their foes, and thus unified the entirety of the land into one continuous empire. This is where history becomes a bit blurry. You see, we are talking about history that's so far in the past that not even writing was all that well adopted. As a result, what we do know is based on local legend and word of mouth that has reached us via ancient Greek historians. The Greeks claimed that the pharaoh who united all of Egypt was a man called Menes. However, these sources also state that when Menes was out on a hunting trip, his dog suddenly turned on him and he had to escape on the back of a crocodile. As a thank you to his crocodilian rescuer, Menes supposedly founded a city called Crocodipolis. Sufficient to say, I have quite a bit of issues with this story. For one, I don't know about you, but I don't think a crocodile would take all kindly to being ridden on by a human. Also, the name of the city is very Greek sounding to me. This actually brings us to an interesting fact about ancient Greek writings. More often than not, they would assign their own Greekified version of names to things. This didn't just end at place names, it also applied to actual people's names. So Menes might not actually be the name of the pharaoh who unified Egypt, rather it is the Greek name for the man who unified Egypt. So what was Menes' real name? Well, after much consideration, many historians now believe Narmer was the actual name of the man who unified Egypt. We have made finds directly linking with this king, specifically the Narmer palette, which shows the king finishing off his conquest of Lower Egypt with his famous mace, which coincidentally we have also found. We also know that Narmer was king over both lands, as on both sides of the Narmer palette we see him wearing the distinct white crown of Upper Egypt as well as the red crown of Lower Egypt. Eventually, in an act of symbolism, the two crowns were merged into one distinctive crown, technically forming the first empire in the process. So what do I think of this? Well, I think we are dealing with facts that happen just on the edge of the fog of human history. What do I mean by fog of human history? Well, simply put, without writing, we can't for 100% certain say what happened. There's a large amount of human history that simply is forgotten about, especially the further back you go from the equator. I think the Menes Narmer story is a good example of this. We are lucky that local tradition and myths kept the stories of the first rulers of Egypt in their citizens' memory for long enough that the Greek historians were able to write it down. However, as it was so long ago, certain tales of this person's deeds have been exaggerated, the crocodile story being a prime example of this. However, we are extremely lucky in this regard because we have at least two objects directly linked to Narmer, namely the Narmer palette and his mace. Nevertheless, the unification of Egypt into one entity had a drastic effect on the ancient world. For one, Egypt, due to its highly predictable floods, was able to sustain a large population, all of whom were able to specialize and help develop Egypt into one of the most technologically advanced nations of the ancient world. But what do you think? Let me know down in the comments below.
Thank you for watching and listening to our videos. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe if you've enjoyed. All sources are listed and linked in the description below. I've been the Ancient History Guy, and as always, I'll be seeing you later.